All right, so we're moving on to a new section of the game board now. We are on to the policy makers. So all of the efforts by people and groups in the linkage institution phase now comes to the policy makers, and they decide who the winners and losers of the game are, and what policies they're going to pursue. So, members of Congress. A lot of people want to be in Congress because it's a really good job to have. As of 2009, we have about a $174,000 a year salary, but the lifestyle of a member of Congress is much higher than that because you get so many of the perks that go along with your salary. There's lots of things you don't have to pay for. You get really generous retirement. You get office space both in Washington and in your local constituency. You get things like travel allowances, which are called junkets, franking privileges, just free mail and duplication, things that are going to help you keep getting reelected over and over again. And then lots of other perks like memberships and access to various institutions. It is a very demanding job, lots of hours, very busy, not a lot of downtime, but you get to live a very I would say glamorous lifestyle, but a very affluent lifestyle. You get to touch bases with the movers and shakers quite a bit, and you can set yourself up for life just by getting elected. Just one time would do that for you. There are 535 members of Congress, and that includes 100 senators, 2 from each state, and 435 representatives that are elected based on population. Every state has at least one congressional district, and we have a single member district plurality system, which means every district has one elected official. To be in the House, you have to be at least 25 years old, live in the state that you represent, and have lived in the U.S. for the last 7 years. You do not have to be natural born, though. Senators must be 30 years old, live in the state they represent on election day, and have lived in the U.S. for at least 9 years. So we can see that the requirements for being a senator are higher than those of the House, because in the original days, being a senator meant that you were from the elite, whereas the people's voices were represented in the House. Now, these days, we talked about campaign finance and the fact that understanding politics and knowing how the game works requires people to be relatively intelligent, especially in the areas of business and law. And so, by nature, to get elected to the Senate, we have a lot of people who are already wealthy, usually attorneys who know the law and know how things work. And so, when we talk about democracy and how fair it is it really the voice of the people? Well, in the House, you have a much better chance as an average person of average wealth to be elected to the House compared to the Senate, where you do have to be a little bit more of the elite going in. The House members serve 2-year terms, and all 435 seats are up for election every 2 years. So we have congressional elections every 2 years. Every single one of the seats of the U.S. House are up for election every year. And campaigns these days last about a year. And so when you get elected to the House, you get about a year to do your job, and then you are back on the campaign trail again. So members of the House who are career politicians are constantly campaigning, and they get really good at campaigning, which is why, as we'll see in a moment, incumbents almost never lose. In the Senate, we also have elections every 2 years, but only a third of them of the seats are up for election. And that is because in the original Constitution, they staggered the seats so that we didn't wind up with a whole new class of senators in one given election. So in other words, we have a tidal wave election where the mentality of the voters is get rid of all the bums. You'd wind up with a whole bunch of freshman senators, and that's not what they wanted to happen. And so in the very first class of senators, a third of them got 2-year terms, a third of them got 4-year terms, and a third of them got 6-year terms. And then from that point forward, every senator would get 6-year terms. So they created a staggered grouping of senators. Okay, so in the next Senate election that we have, on an even-numbered year, about a third of the seats will be up for election. It's never exactly a third, but about a third. All right, incumbents. Incumbents almost never lose. In the modern era, they're over 90% successful in getting themselves reelected, especially in the House. Like I mentioned before, members of the House are constantly campaigning, and they're also targeting local constituencies. If you represent a district, basically everybody in that district, for the most part, is for the most part going to be kind of in the same, same ideology, same uh, class, and there's variations for sure, but you have a much smaller group that you have to target, and so it's if they voted for you once, the people aren't changing too much, and so you can definitely get elected again. And there are lots of advantages that you have to get yourself elected. You can point to your casework. You can say, look what I've done for you, as opposed to your challenger who can only make promises and say what they will do in the future if they get elected. The incumbent can say, I've already done this stuff for you. I've delivered the pork barrel projects to you, which is I've got Congress to fund local projects and send our district money directly. And so they can point to a record that they've already had. They have advantages in advertising. They have, because people know where they stand, they usually generate a lot more campaign donations, somewhere around 12 times more campaign donations than the challenger, for the same reason as I mentioned before. When you have a record, people know where you're going to stand. And so they have a much more solid foundation on whether they should give money to you, as opposed to a challenger where you're kind of guessing. So, when do incumbents lose? A couple of different situations. Number one, if you are involved in a scandal or have been pegged for some kind of corruption, you can definitely lose. Sometimes when we do redistricting, which is we change the lines that define our districts, sometimes they basically eliminate your district and you're out of a job. Or they redistrict in a way that your base that got you elected is no longer there. More on redistricting in a little while. And then political tidal waves. This can happen more with the Senate than it does with the House. So in other words, if it's a bad year for Republicans across the country and you're a Republican, you could lose. You could have a great record. You could have been beloved just a year earlier. But if the president is unpopular and he's a Republican and you're a Republican, then you might just get voted out just because you have that little R by your name. Or if you have that little D by your name, and it's a bad year for Democrats. When we have an open seat, competition is greater. Sometimes people retire, sometimes people die, sometimes people resign, and then you get two challengers for an open seat. And that's where you get most of the turnover in Congress, especially in the House. Not because somebody loses. Remember, only 5 to 10% of the time does somebody lose who was an incumbent. It's when they just quit. Maybe they become a senator. Maybe they become governor. Maybe they run for president. This is when we get changeover in the Congress. And because of all these things, change is very slow, and it's hard to get rid of people. And so you wind up with these members of the House and members of the Senate who have been there for 30 years or 40 years. And for that reason, people say we should have term limits. We should have a 3-term limit for senators, 4 or 5-term limits for members of the House. We haven't gotten around to it because who would have to institute that change or initiate that change? It would be Congress themselves, and who is going to vote for something that may lead to you losing your job someday. All right, the idea of bicameralism is fundamental to democracy. And the reason we do this, which is to say we have 2 chambers that operate differently. And I mentioned before, the House was always supposed to be, and I think still is today, the chamber of Congress that is most connected to the people, to the masses, the average folks. Now, make no mistake about it, big money and wealthy people and powerful people do have a major influence in the House, but it is connected to the people more than the Senate is. But also with bicameralism, this allows for each chamber to operate and function in different ways as well. So for example, in the House, we have a much more structured procedural protocol than in the Senate. And we call these procedures rules. For example, the way that the House is going to set up how a bill gets passed, or how they designate who's on what committees, or how just every little thing that they do in operations. They have little rules about how they do that. And the House has certain rules for their procedures, and the Senate has certain rules for their procedures. Traditionally, the House is much more structured than the Senate. There's a little rule for everything in the House of Representatives. And the public doesn't hear about these things too much unless you're really following the House closely, or you're watching C-SPAN, and you'll see some of these rules carried out. But just to give you an idea, the House has an actual rules committee that basically sets up rules and enforces rules. And the main thing that they do is set the House's agenda. So obviously the big thing that Congress is going to do is pass bills, make laws. In the House, it's a very structured procedure about how an infant bill that's being sponsored for the first time works its way through Congress and then eventually becomes a law someday. The House Rules Committee is kind of the gatekeeper, because the Rules Committee decides which bills are going to be entertained by the House, which ones get scheduled onto the agenda, where they're going to go through to committees, how long they're going to be debated, dates and all kinds of things. A very neat and tidy schedule for how a bill becomes a law. The Rules Committee can also, as the gatekeeper, decide if a bill is even going to see the light of day. If for political reasons or whatever kind of reason they decide we're not going to let this bill ever get through, they can kill it before it even has a chance. The Speaker of the House is very powerful because that person gets to decide who is on that committee. And usually the Speaker, along with the Rules Committee and the rest of the leadership, are going to be very powerful people in the House. They are the ones setting the agenda. Another unique thing about the House of Representatives is that they must launch all revenue bills. This is a constitutional requirement. So in other words, anytime we have a new tax coming through the Congress, it's supposed to start in the House of Representatives. And this was just something that the framers put in to give the House a little bit more oomph, so it wasn't so drastically less powerful than the Senate, which is true. Also, impeachments are started in the House of Representatives. If you want to get rid of the president, the charges are brought up by the House. That's the impeachment. And then the Senate gets to decide guilty or innocent of those charges. Now, the Senate, as I've said before, was designed to protect the voice of the elite. And they have lots more powers as compared to the House. In other words, the original framers were not going to entrust major powers like confirming presidential appointments and ratifying treaties and removing impeached officials. They weren't going to let that be in the hands of the House. They wanted the experts, the elite, to be able to make those decisions. And that's why the Senate has so many more powers. It was more trusted. But also, it's very much less centralized and less hierarchical than the House. I said a moment ago, the House is very rigid in all of its rules and procedures. Everything is very tightly knit. In the Senate, it's not that way. For example, we have the filibuster that I'll talk about in a moment. The filibuster, they can debate a bill forever. How long are we going to talk about this bill? I don't know. We'll just keep going until whatever. And the procedures just are much more flexible. There is no Rules Committee, and that's part of the reason. They do have rules in the Senate, but there's no committee that would suggest that they're so rigid on the rules. So therefore, there's that, and as far as the agenda goes, how bills become law, the party leaders decide kind of at their own discretion in an informal way about what bills get on the agenda, what committees they go to, and how it's going to be debated on the floor and all that. But clearly, the most important rule that the Senate has is the filibuster. There is no filibuster in the House, only in the Senate. Here's how it works. In the Senate, we have no Rules Committee, and therefore we have no set duration for how long a bill can be debated. In the House of Representatives, if a bill comes up for debate, the Rules Committee is going to say, we're going to debate this bill for 1 week, or we're going to debate this bill for 3 days. In the Senate, there is no such designation. A bill could theoretically be debated in the Senate forever. They don't set any duration on that. So therefore, it becomes a political theater for the minority party to sometimes try to stop a bill from moving forward by never yielding the floor during the debate. And so the famous example is Strom Thurmond, who was a senator from North Carolina for a very long time, like 60-something years. He got up there and read from the phone book with a pee bucket at his side for 24 hours because he couldn't stop. That's why he had the pee bucket. As soon as you stop, you lose the floor. And so he stood up there and went continuously for 24 hours. And the idea was, if you keep talking, somebody's going to say, you know what, screw this. We're tired of listening to you. We'll give up on the bill. Now, the only way to stop someone from talking, or the only way, technically, what we're talking about here is the only way to end debate on a bill in the Senate is to vote for cloture. And this requires 60 votes. Remember, to pass a bill, you only need 50% plus 1, which is 51 votes if everybody's present. But to end debate, you need 60 votes. So these days, it's very rare for parties to have 60 votes. The Democrats did have 60 votes after the 2008 election, which is how they got Obamacare through. But if you don't have 60 votes, there's no way to vote for cloture as on a clear party vote. And so therefore, you can't stop a filibuster. So what does all this mean? This is all a bit confusing. Here's what it means. Essentially, what you need to get a controversial bill through, or a major bill through the Senate, you need 60 votes, because you can't end debate and block a filibuster without 60 votes. Therefore, even if you're a majority party, let's say you got 54 in your party and you've controlled the Senate, you can put a controversial bill up there. The party who only has 46 in the Senate can stand up and say, we're going to filibuster, and if you can't stop us, this bill is going nowhere. And so it's one of these situations where the rules of the Senate have kind of superseded what the expectation of the Constitution was. Constitution says that you need a majority of the votes to pass a bill in the Senate. The filibuster rule, however, requires that you get 60 votes through. This is very difficult to attain on any kind of controversial bill, and it's another reason why the Senate produces very little these days in this era of divided government. And if the Senate doesn't pass the bill, well, it doesn't matter if the House passed it or not. Both chambers have to pass the bill, and so therefore we get nothing. And this is one of the major reasons why we have a do-nothing Congress these days, who just sit around and debate and bicker and make speeches but don't really produce anything. All right, let's talk a little bit about the personnel of the different chambers of Congress. In the House, the leader is the Speaker, and the Speaker is a constitutional position defined. The way you become the Speaker of the House is these days is by having your party have the majority in Congress. So right now, as I speak, Republicans have the majority numbers in the House, and so therefore they get to choose their guy or gal for the Speaker position. The Speaker is third in line for the executive, behind the President and the Vice President. Their duties are to preside over all House sessions. They basically set the agenda. They get to make all committee appointments. This is a major power of the Speaker. So they get to decide who the chairman of all the committees are, who is going to be members of each of the different committees. They assign the bills to different committees to be worked on. Essentially what all this means is that they decide which bills are going to have a chance to make it through. They, along with the Rules Committee, which is obviously populated by the Speaker. Now, the party with the minority numbers their head is the minority leader. Now, here's what can happen, though. Let's say right now the Democrats have fewer numbers than the Republicans in the House, so their leader is the minority leader. If we have an election and then the Democrats take over the House, well, then the minority leader, presto, becomes the Speaker of the House, and the Speaker of the House becomes the minority leader, unless they decide to make some kind of change. We also have whips in both parties of the House. The whips are also party leaders. They're second, third, fourth in line, depending on the situation. But they are essentially the liaisons between the party leaders and the party members. So whenever we have a bill being worked through Congress, you have the leadership kind of in one huddle, and they send the whips out to see where everybody is on the bill. And if we have some kind of holdup, then the speaker and the leadership is going to say, okay, whip, go out there to the such and such office and see where they are on the bill, see what they want if they're holding out, ask them what we can do to move the bill along, or any kind of other communication that might take place between the leaders and the party members. So the whips are kind of the human telegraph throughout the House of Representatives. In the Senate, we have very similar positions of power. There is no speaker in the Senate. In this case, the ceremonial head of the Senate is the Vice President of the United States. However, they don't really have a day-to-day function in the Senate. The only time you'll ever see the Vice President sitting with the Senate is if they're there to cast a tie-breaking vote. So if you have a 50-50 vote in the Senate, the Speaker of the House can walk over from the White House, the Vice President can walk over from the White House and cast a tie-breaking vote. Almost never happens. The only other time you'll see the Vice President is in January after an election, and they'll sit as head of the Senate to officiate the counting of the vote, make the votes official. You have a Senate pro temp in the Senate, and this is usually the senior member of the majority party. So it's kind of like a victory lap for some old dude who's been in the Senate for 40 or 50 years. They don't really do much. The only thing they would do is fill in for the VP for vote breaking or tie breaking, and we already know that the Vice President hardly ever has to do that. And then what chance would there be if there was a tie vote and the Vice President couldn't be there? I mean, it's mainly kind of a badge that you wear as the senior member of the majority party to get to be the Senate pro temp, but they don't really do anything. The Senate in day-to-day affairs is headed by the Senate Majority Leader. So again, whoever has the majority, their leader gets to set the agenda. Not as fully as in the House, but definitely the most powerful person, the Majority Leader. We've got minority leaders, we got whips, everything else kind of functions the same as it does in the House. All right, I want to take a look at committees now. Most of the work that it gets done in the Senate and in the House is done through committees. We don't see this on TV very much, but most of the work that's actually meaningful is done behind closed doors in these committees. And sometimes they do broadcast on TV some of their meetings, or if somebody's giving testimony to a congressional committee, you'll see it on TV sometimes. But the main thing we're talking about here is writing bills. When we have an idea for a new law and the leadership of a certain chamber assigns it to committees, we're basically saying this is where they're writing the bills. And it's boring stuff for the TV viewer, and so you're not going to see it on TV, but this is where the most important work happens. The other major function of committees is oversight of other branches. And so from time to time, you'll turn on the TV and you'll see somebody from the executive branch giving testimony about some kind of problem or the state of affairs in a certain area, and they'll be giving testimony to some committee of Congress. This is a constitutional power of Congress to oversee the executive branch and what it's doing. They have what we call investigative power. And so, if you get summoned by Congress to testify, then it carries the weight of law. You better show up. So those two things are what committees do. There are a couple different types. We have standing committees. These are permanent committees. These are mainly the committees that are going to handle bill writing. So you've got a House Energy Committee that's going to write energy bills, and you've got the Senate Agriculture Committee that's going to work on agriculture bills being funneled through the Senate. They are confined to each House, and so you've got House standing committees and you've got Senate standing committees. The average House member serves on 2 to 4 of these committees, and the average senator serves on 3 to 7 standing committees. We have joint committees that are kind of the same as standing committees, but they're made up of both members of the House and the Senate. And there's only a couple of these joint committees, and they're confined to big issues. And so we have a joint committee on the economy. So whenever we have a big economic crisis, you'll see the Joint Committee on Economics, made up of members of both chambers, get together and try to figure out some solutions. You also have conference committees, which are also made up of members of both chambers. But this only happens after the bills have been written and we come to an impasse where both chambers can't pass the same version of the bill. Because what can happen is, let's say the House passes version A of the bill, the Senate then gets a hold of it and decides it wants to change the bill and then passes version B. Constitution requires that the same version of the bill be passed through both chambers. So what they'll do in that situation is they'll come together, compromise, and negotiate and hammer out a version C of the bill, and then send it back to both chambers again, and with the hope that both sides will pass the same version of the bill. So that's a conference committee. And then you got a select committee, which is a committee that's convened for a special purpose. So whenever you have a major event like Watergate or Vietnam or 9/11 or Benghazi, you get a committee together made up of members of both chambers, and they'll talk about the situation and more or less, kind of discuss things and then take it back to their chambers to decide what needs to be done. All right, once again, what do committees do? Number one, they pass legislation. There are about 11,000 new bills proposed every 2 years, every cycle of Congress. The vast majority of those never see the light of day. And I'm talking about the vast, vast majority of those never see the light of day, either because they never make it through the committee phase, or because they get voted down, or they just kind of sit around. And sometimes they're defeated. Committees and subcommittees when they get their hands on a bill proposal, they're going to research the bills. And by the way, they have huge teams of lawyers and policy wonks and people who do research, all kinds of things. They'll hear witnesses from interest groups. They'll read reports and develop reports. And then they'll pass it along and change the bill, mark it up is what they say. And you got to remember that one bill might be being handled by multiple committees, and so they're all going to put their own stuff in it. And it's lots of compromise, lots of negotiation, lots of committee work, which is why whenever you get a hold of a document or something that a committee has worked on, you've got just tons of stuff in there that isn't always coherent because everybody wanted to get their little thing in to make their voters happy. And so a lot of times you wind up with a pretty big mess. These days, when Congress passes a bill, it's 10,000 pages or 50,000 pages, ridiculous stuff like that. Another reason why you got to be a lawyer to be a member of Congress. And then the other big thing that committees do is they provide oversight. We talked about this already. So whenever you've got some kind of problem or controversy or issue that is going on in the executive branch with the president of the bureaucracy, the congressional committees will kind of take a look at it, investigate, and that could be also things like problems and issues, but also things like budgets. When they're putting the budget together, a bureaucracy can sit in front of a congressional committee and for the budget. There are budget committees. And say, yeah, we want this, we want that, and that can happen as well. Committees often threaten to cut budgets if bureaucracies do not do as they wish. We can get into budgets later, but there is a, talking about budgets, that there's a lot of policy making competition going on with how much money is spent by Congress. Remember, Congress carries the power of the purse. And even though they kind of check each other, the legislative and executive branches, ultimately it's the decision of Congress as to how much gets paid out. But bureaucracies are the ones who actually get to implement the law. And so there's a give and take there. And so you see some pretty awesome showdowns between bureaucracies and the committees when you hear somebody giving testimony. How do you get on to a committee? Well, you can bet on this. When you first get elected for the very first time, you do your best to get on the best committees you can. So you start writing letters and you start rubbing shoulders, and figuratively speaking, and you do the best you can. But at the end of the day, it is based on the seniority system. You basically are going to get on the best committees if you've been around the longest and you've done your time and you've been an attack dog or you've been a loyal party member. Then you can get on the best committees in Congress. And there are ones that are better than others. Believe me, you don't want to wind up on the Agriculture Committee. You'd much rather be on the Foreign Relations Committee or the Budget Committee or the Judiciary Committee, because then you get to handle some more urgent national matters. But when you get into Congress for the very first time, especially in the House, you're going to be on, kind of the lower level committees, and you got to prove yourself and work your way up. And the ones who are able to be savvy enough to get it, to get the game, then you can rise to really high levels in the House and Senate, get yourself up there into a leadership position down the road, and then you never know. Now you're talking, maybe you make a presidential run at some point. And it all kind of starts on, your career begins with getting elected and then getting onto a committee. And that's basically where everybody starts. And where you end up speaks to how good of a politician you are and how much time you're willing to put in and how much dirty work you're willing to do.